The Morton Barn stood like a broken tooth on the edge of the village, its beams leaning with age, its roof patched with scraps of tin and tar. Children were told it was nothing more than a ruin, the kind of place where rats gnawed through grain sacks and owls nested in the rafters. Yet there was a stillness around it that unsettled even the most hardened farmers. At night, when the wind shifted across the fields, people swore they heard noises inside. Not the restless shuffle of livestock or the creak of wood bending in the dark, but something raw and desperate, a sound that carried the ache of a trapped throat. They said it was easy to mistake it for the wind. But the ones who lived closest never confused it. The cries that slipped through the boards sounded human. The Mortons themselves dismissed the stories. They were a family admired for their discipline, their devotion to faith, and the strength of their work. Their land was prosperous compared to others, their hands always offered when the church needed repair, their table always open to travelers passing through. To speak against them felt near to blasphemy, and so the villagers convinced themselves that the barn was empty, no matter how many times the whispers returned. Still, a few who lingered outside its rotting walls after dark described a rhythm in the noises. Not random, not animal, but something almost patterned, as if a ritual of pain was unfolding inside, timed with a cruel precision. The sound did not surge like panic. It ebbed and pulsed like the work of hands that understood suffering and how to stretch it into hours. By day, the barn carried an ordinary quiet. The doors hung crooked, the windows stuffed with straw. Tools rusted against the siding. But if one stepped close enough, the smell could not be ignored. It was not the smell of manure or spoiled hay. It was sharper, metallic. A sweetness turned rancid. The odor sank into the soil, carrying with it the weight of something that refused to be buried. Stray dogs would not approach the barn. Birds never perched on its beams. There was an absence of life around it that no natural decay could explain. Yet still the villagers repeated the same line. The barn was abandoned, the barn was safe, the barn was nothing. At night, when the village was still, a heavy presence seemed to rise from it, spreading across the fields in a hush that pressed against the houses. Sleep came uneasily, and those who woke at the wrong hour swore they felt watched. Some recalled hearing what they thought were footsteps circling their windows, though no marks appeared in the dirt come morning. Others heard scraping like nails dragged across wood, steady and deliberate. When asked, the Mortons offered calm smiles. They said barns moaned in the wind, wood shifted as it aged, and animals prowled in search of warmth. They answered with the certainty of people who could not be doubted. And in the face of their composure, the villagers buried their fears deeper, but in silence a few could not forget. They remembered a boy who had vanished years earlier after being sent on an errand near the Morton fields. They recalled a maid who had left their service without notice, though no one ever saw her on the road that led away. These memories were fragile things, smothered by respect for the family. Yet when the wind rose and the barn's hollow boards groaned, the names of the missing seemed to echo with the cries. The barn stood as a shadow at the edge of memory, never alive, never empty, always listening. And as the seasons turned, the cries did not fade. They only sank deeper into the wood, as if the barn itself was learning to keep them, storing each sound in its beams, waiting for the day it would all be heard. The Morton family lived in a manner that made suspicion impossible. Their farm was orderly, their appearances at church unwavering, and their generosity toward neighbors often spoken of with gratitude. On Sundays, their pew was filled from end to end, heads bowed, lips moving in steady prayer. No one questioned their piety, for they gave to the poor, welcomed orphans into their home on cold nights, and repaired fences for widows without asking for coin. The village leaned on them like a pillar, trusting that their virtue was unshakable. And yet, like all facades built too perfectly, cracks ran deep beneath the polish. Behind the farmhouse walls, beyond the barn that seemed to whisper in the night, their darkest truth lived under their own roof. His name was Elias Morton, the second son, the quiet one. To the public, he was praised for his stillness, a boy who never argued, never disrupted, who seemed carved from patience. But stillness is not always the mark of peace. In Elias, it was the mark of hunger, a hunger that had no words, no innocence, and no end. He observed the world with an unblinking focus, studying the movements of others the way some study the weather, watching how people bent when pressure was applied. While his siblings laughed and played in the yard, Elias lingered at the edges, eyes following with an attention that unsettled those who caught it. Mothers sometimes whispered that the boy's stare was too steady, too knowing for his age, but such doubts dissolved in the shadow of the Morton family's reputation. It was easier to call him shy than to name the unease for what it was. Elias grew in the silence of that protection, wrapped in a trust that allowed his shadow to deepen unchecked. His father boasted of his discipline. His mother praised his composure. The pastor admired his devotion. Each compliment carved deeper the mask Elias wore, a mask so convincing it concealed the dark calculations forming beneath. He learned quickly that kindness offered in public gave freedom in private. The more he was praised, the more space he was given. The more he was trusted, the less anyone thought to question where he wandered or what he did alone in the barn when dusk fell. Inside, Elias cultivated a mind that turned every fragment of life into a study of control. He watched calves being tethered for slaughter and wondered not about meat or survival, but about the eyes of the animal as it realized escape was impossible. He lingered when the blacksmith worked iron, observing how heat bent solid metal into any shape demanded of it. He listened when the midwife spoke of childbirth, noting her language about bodies torn open, stretched, stitched, and forced back together. These were not passing curiosities. They were pieces he stored, arranging them in a private logic, each detail a tool, each observation a future act waiting for a victim. To his family, Elias was dutiful. He carried wood, scrubbed tools, and sang hymns without complaint. To his community, he was dependable, the boy who could be trusted to deliver letters or guide travelers along the road. But every act of service was hollow, for Elias did not see these duties as kindness. He saw them as practice. Each smile he offered, each task performed was a rehearsal in disguise, a test of how long one could perform innocence before suspicion stirred. And suspicion never stirred. The villagers loved the Mortons too deeply to see the truth. They saw Elias's stillness as virtue, not vacancy. They called his quiet eyes thoughtful, not devouring. They laughed at his slow speech, not hearing how each word was weighed like a stone dropped into a well. What no one understood was that Elias's calm did not protect them. It prepared him. His mask of obedience bought him silence. His reputation built him walls no one dared breach. And within those walls, within the barn that was said to be empty, he began feeding the hunger that respect allowed him to hide. The cries that had been heard at night were not dismissed by Elias. They were cherished. For to him they were proof that the mask worked, that the world outside would never look too closely at what was happening within. And so he waited, watched, and grew more certain that he was untouchable. The boy the world called virtuous was already gone. What remained was a mind studying cruelty with the patience of a saint and the devotion of a priest, planning the first of many rituals that would stain the land forever. In his youth, Elias began to speak of medicine. To the villagers, it was a noble ambition, one that matched the dignity of his family. They were proud to hear that he sought knowledge not for war or trade, but for healing, and they gave him cast-off books when they could find them. Anatomy texts, sermons on the human body as God's creation, crude drawings from traveling surgeons. Elias gathered them all, binding them together into a secret library that grew in the loft above the Morton Barn. When neighbors asked what he studied so late by candlelight, Elias lowered his eyes and spoke with a humble voice, saying he wished to save lives, to understand pain so he could relieve it. None suspected that he spoke half a truth, for he was not lying when he said he wished to understand pain. The books themselves were ordinary, their pages filled with stiff sketches of bones and organs, veins drawn like rivers across the body. But Elias did not leave them unchanged. He began to alter them, scrawling in margins, adding pages of his own hand, reshaping knowledge into something unholy. Where a book showed a heart cut clean, Elias added diagrams of how one might keep it beating outside the chest. Where the text spoke of lungs, he drew images of them pierced with reeds, imagining the sound they might make if wind was forced through them like a pipe. He mapped the body as though it were not flesh, but an instrument, each part a string or drum to be played with patience and cruelty. Over time, his sketches became rituals in themselves. He drew circles around organs, lines connecting limbs in patterns that made no sense to medicine but carried a terrible order all the same. He wrote questions that revealed the depth of his thinking. How long can a body live if deprived of voice but not breath? What suffering can be drawn out if blood is drained in rhythm instead of all at once? How does terror mark the skin if the victim is not allowed to scream? These notes did not drift into idle thought. They were plans waiting for flesh, and Elias's steady hand ensured that nothing he imagined remained vague. Each diagram was drawn with precision, as though he expected one day to replicate them without error. The villagers who glanced at his work saw only harmless ambition. They did not notice the added pages, the strange geometry written between the lines. They believed his interest a sign of intelligence, a young man who might one day bring respect to their forgotten village. Some even gave him more materials, convinced they were nurturing a healer. They could not see that the books had become scripture for Elias, a gospel of pain, rewritten to suit his obsession. And as the seasons passed, he grew less interested in the knowledge offered by others and more consumed with the visions that rose from within. His drawings no longer resembled lessons. They resembled blueprints for cruelty. Elias spoke little of his studies, but when pressed, he explained with the same still calm that had always disarmed suspicion. He said he hoped to prevent death in childbirth, to cure fever, to mend broken bodies. The words sounded righteous, but his eyes betrayed no warmth when he spoke them. His gaze was fixed inward, as though watching something private unfold. Those who met it often felt unsettled, though they could not explain why. They mistook the chill of that stare for shyness, never realizing they were looking into a mind that saw them not as people but as pieces. Organs, nerves, veins, and fears, each awaiting its place in his dark experiments. In the loft above the barn, where dust clung to rafters and shadows lingered thick, Elias continued to expand his secret codex. Each page carried with it a thought too dangerous to be spoken, yet he spoke them to himself as he drew, murmuring like a priest in prayer. In those quiet hours, surrounded by the smell of old wood and wax, Elias no longer seemed like a boy with dreams of medicine. He seemed like something else entirely, something patient and exacting, something that believed pain could be shaped into an art that the world was not yet ready to see. And so the barn gathered not only cries in its boards, but words and drawings pressed deep into paper, each one a seed of cruelty waiting to be planted. Elias's studies were not preparation for healing. They were rehearsals for rituals that only his hands would ever dare to perform. The storm came with a violence that silenced the village. Rain hammered roofs, winds tore branches, and thunder shook the walls of houses already weary from years of decay. On such nights, people prayed for their homes to hold, for fires not to start, for animals not to scatter into the black. It was in this chaos that a servant boy vanished. He had been sent from a nearby farm to check the tether of livestock, and when he did not return, the family assumed he had taken shelter. But morning revealed no trace. His footsteps ended at the edge of the Morton fields, swallowed into the mud as if the storm itself had taken him. Neighbors whispered of wolves or river currents, but no body was found. What they could not see was that the boy had not been lost to chance. He had been chosen. Elias had been waiting. He had followed the storm as others followed sermons, watching the night as if it were opening doors only he could see. In the roar of thunder he heard cover, in the blindness of rain he saw opportunity. The boy was small, easy to seize, his cries buried beneath the storm's violence. No one would hear. No one would suspect. By the time the village woke to search, Elias had already carried him into the barn, the doors closed, the Cries trapped within walls that had long ago learned how to keep secrets. The boy did not die at once. Elias did not want him to. Death had no value if it came too quickly, no lesson if it was only silence. Elias wanted to study fear itself, to learn whether terror could be stretched into something permanent, etched into the body like a scar that never faded. He bound the boy to a wooden beam, securing him with ropes that cut deep but held firm, then stepped back to observe the trembling. To Elias, the shaking was not horror but data, not suffering but evidence of how flesh answered when the mind was broken open. His chosen method was one he had drawn many times in his altered books. He had sharpened reeds from the riverbank until they were hard as needles, smooth enough to slide between ribs without breaking. One by one he pressed them into the boy's sides, shallow at first, careful not to pierce the lungs, only to anchor in the flesh. The sound that came when the boy tried to breathe fascinated him. Each inhale rattled against the reeds, each exhale whistled like a pipe played by a cruel hand. Elias leaned close, listening as the body became an instrument. Each cry distorted into a hollow music. He called it singing, though it was no song of joy. It was a chorus of despair, conducted by his hand, sustained by his patience. The boy fought, but Elias had planned for this too. He pressed his palm against the chest to feel the rhythm of the heart, watching how the sound of the reeds changed with panic. He noted the intervals of gasps, the way the pitch sharpened when the ropes cut deeper with every struggle. To him it was not chaos but harmony, a system of responses he believed revealed the true language of fear. He whispered to himself as though recording findings, not in words of comfort, but in cold, steady fragments. How long before the voice breaks? How long before the body accepts silence? By dawn, the storm had ended, but in the barn, the storm had only begun. The boy's body sagged, his voice reduced to faint rattles, his eyes wide but empty. Elias removed the reeds slowly, carefully, as if handling sacred tools. He examined the holes, noting how they closed when pressed, how they leaked only faint traces of blood when the boy no longer had the strength to breathe deeply. When it was over, Elias did not bury the body. He left it hidden beneath the loft, wrapped in canvas, a secret offering to the barn itself. The building would keep it, just as it kept the Cries in its boards. The village searched the fields and streams for days. They spoke of wolves, of kidnappers, of the storm's cruelty. But the Mortons stood with calm faces, offering prayers and food to the grieving family. Elias attended church with lowered eyes, his voice steady in hymns, his hands folded in prayer. No one saw the truth that the boy's voice had not been stolen by wolves or water, but transformed into a sound Elias believed belonged to him alone. The first taken had become the first instrument, and Elias had only just begun to learn how much music the human body could be forced to make. Elias's hunger was not for death alone. Death was simple, an end that came too quickly and left no space to observe the slow unraveling of the mind. What fascinated him was the state between life and death, when the body still clung to breath but could no longer resist. He wanted silence without loss of awareness, stillness without mercy. And so he began to search for a method that would grant him control over both voice and motion while preserving the victim's ability to feel everything he wished them to endure. His studies led him to an idea both crude and precise. Needles of sharpened bone slid through the narrow space at the base of the skull, severing command without ending consciousness. He crafted these needles from the leg bones of animals, grinding them against stone until they gleamed white and thin. Unlike iron, they carried no sound when handled, no clatter if dropped. They were fragile but exact, tools meant not for strength but for precision. In his altered texts, he had drawn the path carefully. A line from the hollow of the neck to the core of the spine where thought met body. Now he would test whether his theories were true. The victim chosen was a vagrant who had lingered near the village too long, a boy thought to be wandering alone. Elias lured him under promise of shelter, leading him into the barn with the same calm manner he used to greet church elders. No suspicion was raised. After all, kindness was the mask the world most easily believed. Inside, Elias bound the boy and prepared the ritual with a patience that bordered on reverence. He tilted the head forward, fingers tracing the ridge of the neck, feeling for the small hollow beneath the skull. He whispered not comfort but instruction to himself, steadying his hand as the needle hovered. When he pressed it inward, there was no scream, only a sharp gasp and a shudder. The body convulsed, then stilled, arms twitching before falling limp. But the eyes, those remained wide, alive, aware. Elias leaned close, watching as panic filled them, as realization dawned that the body was no longer the victim's to command. In that moment, Elias believed he had created perfection. The boy tried to cry out, but only a faint rasp escaped, broken and hollow. The needle had silenced his voice without taking his breath. To Elias, it was as if the soul itself had been pinned in place, trapped within a shell that could neither fight nor flee. He circled the body slowly, studying the tension in the jaw, the desperate flicker of the eyes that rolled in terror but could not close. He placed his hand on the chest and felt the heart pounding, rapid and helpless, a drumbeat of fear that no one else would ever hear. This silence was not absence, it was a harvest, a stillness that revealed suffering more clearly than screams ever could. In that barn, Elias made silence into ritual. Each insertion of the bone needle became a prayer, each immobilized body an altar. He kept them breathing, watching how long terror could survive when the body was denied both speech and movement. He tested how the silence deepened when days passed, when thirst clawed at the throat, when hunger hollowed the stomach. The victims became mirrors of his power, their inability to resist proof that his control was absolute. He no longer needed ropes to bind them. The needle itself was the chain. To the outside world, Elias's reputation only grew brighter. He spoke often of mercy, of patience, of the duty to treat even the weakest with care. His neighbors saw a young man with the makings of a healer, one whose stillness was virtue, whose kindness was genuine. They did not know that each gentle word was uttered by the same mouth that whispered instructions over paralyzed bodies. They did not see that every quiet smile was earned in the glow of candlelight while someone lay inside the barn, trapped in their own body, screaming only in the silence of their mind. Elias believed he had uncovered a truth no preacher had ever dared to name. Pain did not need sound to exist. Suffering did not need movement to be real. Silence was its own language, and he had learned to write it with bone. From then on, the cries that once leaked through the barn's boards grew fewer, replaced by something worse. An unnatural stillness, a quiet so complete that even the night seemed to hold its breath, listening to the prayer Elias was never content with a single method. Each cruelty perfected only opened the door to another, as though he were building a cathedral of suffering, one chamber at a time. Silence had been his first revelation, but silence was still. He wanted something different now. Movement without freedom, spectacle without voice. He began to study the barn itself, the beams that crossed above, the loft where shadows lived. He saw in those timbers a stage waiting to be used, a place where bodies could be arranged not as corpses but as actors in a performance of pain that only he would ever attend. The tools were simple: ropes, pulleys, hooks carved smooth. To the villagers, these things hung like any farmer's supplies. To Elias, they became instruments for bending life into shapes no one should endure. He built a lattice across the rafters, ropes stretched like veins above the loft. He tested their strength with sacks of grain, then with slaughtered livestock, lifting and lowering until the system moved as smoothly as his hand. Once perfected, he began with a living subject. He bound wrists and ankles, threading ropes through pulleys so that with one pull he could lift an entire body from the floor, spread wide or drawn tight, every joint at his command. He discovered that the human frame resisted only at first. With steady pressure, shoulders cracked from their sockets, hips tore loose, knees bent in reverse. The screams were sharp but brief, until the body gave in and hung limp, alive but ruined, suspended like a marionette whose strings were held by a merciless god. The loft became his theater, each victim a figure arranged in grotesque tableau. Some hung with arms twisted backward, others arched into bows that never released, their chests heaving as ropes cut deeper into skin. Elias experimented with patterns, crossing limbs into shapes, bending torsos until bones strained like green wood about to snap. He did not allow them to die quickly. When circulation faltered and consciousness waned, he forced broth down their throats with funnels, keeping them alive enough to continue the performance. They became props that breathed, mannequins with hearts pounding beneath stretched flesh, unwilling actors in a play of control. From outside, nothing looked unusual. Villagers passing the barn at dusk saw ropes swaying gently from the loft windows, as if laundry had been strung to dry. Some even remarked on the orderliness of it, the way the lines were drawn so straight, the way cloth seemed to ripple in the breeze. They did not know that what moved inside was not linen but flesh. Limbs rocking as ropes pulled taut, faces turned toward the floor in silent agony. The barn wore its disguise well, a mask of ordinary labor that concealed a chamber where humanity itself was unstitched. Elias grew meticulous in his rituals. He mapped each pulley's placement, recording how different angles tore joints more cleanly, how weight distributed across ropes prolonged suffering. He began to believe the human body was meant for this, that its very structure invited him to dismantle it. He whispered to himself that he was not destroying life but reshaping it, forcing it into truths no one else dared imagine. In those moments, watching his victim sway in the dim light, Elias felt closer to revelation than any sermon could bring. He believed he had made a stage where silence and suffering merged into art. The theater of ropes became his sanctuary. Nights stretched into dawn as he adjusted poses, as he listened to the faint gurgles and gasps that escaped broken throats. He touched the ropes with reverence, feeling how they carried the weight of life in his hands. It was not enough to watch one body at a time. Soon he arranged several, lifting them together, weaving their limbs into collective forms, a human lattice mirroring the wooden beams above. To him it was balance, symmetry, proof that cruelty could be ordered, that pain could be made into structure. And still the villagers saw only lines swaying in the loft, whispering to one another that the Mortons kept their barn neat despite its age. They could not hear the muffled gasps that trembled above them, could not see the eyes wide in terror just beyond the boards. Elias remained untouched, his reputation unshaken, while within the barn the theater grew ever more elaborate, every rope a thread in the fabric of his secret faith. And as his methods deepened, the barn itself seemed to creak in rhythm, as though it too had accepted the performance, as though the walls were learning to keep time with the silent music Elias made from broken bodies, repeated with every needle he drove into flesh. Elias's theater of ropes had shown him how to bend bodies into forms of his choosing, but still the sound of terror broke through. Screams, whimpers, ragged cries, they disrupted the purity of his ritual. He did not want noise that spilled out uncontrolled. He wanted obedience. He wanted fear held inward where it could not escape. It was during a night when candle wax dripped across his hand that he realized how the substance behaved. It burned, then cooled, then hardened into a casing that fixed skin beneath it. Pain was sealed under the surface, unable to breathe, unable to release. In that moment, Elias understood that wax could do what ropes could not. It could command silence. It could hold suffering captive inside the body itself. He began with small experiments. A thin layer poured across an arm, allowed to cool until the victim's skin shone as if covered in glass. The cries were sharp at first, but soon became muffled, strangled not by rope or gag, but by the body's own reaction. He realized that wax suffocated not lungs, but expression. It trapped agony beneath its smooth surface, forcing every nerve to writhe unseen. Elias added more, pouring across faces, across lips pressed shut by his hand. When it hardened, the mouth could no longer open. The jaw locked beneath layers, the scream sealed inside. To Elias it was not cruelty but order. Terror no longer polluted the air. Terror stayed where it belonged, inside. In time he built his ritual into a process. He heated great pots of wax in the barn, stirring them with iron rods until the smell filled the loft. He bound his victims upright and began to coat them slowly, beginning with hands, moving to the chest, then at last the face. He worked in layers, each one smothering what little voice tried to break free. He believed the body fought not only against death but against silence, and he took delight in conquering that final resistance. The eyes remained wide, trapped above the mask, darting, pleading. But the rest of the face was buried beneath yellowed sheets that cooled into armor. Elias called them obedient masks, for beneath them every attempt at sound was pressed into nothing. Victims did not suffocate as one might expect. They breathed through their noses until the wax crept higher, until even those passages closed under his hand. Death came not in a rush, but in a drawn-out panic, the body convulsing against silence, the chest heaving with air that could no longer pass. Elias pressed his ear to the hardened surface, listening to the faintest vibrations of a scream no one else would ever hear. He told himself the wax preserved it, that the terror lived on beneath the mask, sealed and eternal. What others called death, he believed, was transformation. Fear transformed into silence, voice into permanence. The barn soon filled with these grotesque figures. Wax-coated bodies stood propped against beams, their faces frozen in smooth masks, their eyes the only part left alive in memory. To anyone who stumbled upon them, they would look like statues, figures molded by a cruel sculptor. But to Elias, they were his congregation. Each one a lesson in control, each one proof that sound itself could be commanded. He began to arrange them in rows as if they were witnesses to his sermons whispered in the dark. He preached to them of silence, of obedience, of the sacred bond between pain and restraint. In his mind, he was no longer experimenting. He was leading a congregation in worship, and the wax was the sacrament. To the village, the smell of smoke from his fires was nothing unusual. They thought he was sealing tools, making candles, practicing trades that were harmless. They did not know that each flame in the barn was feeding a ritual that turned the living into voiceless effigies. They passed by, hearing nothing, seeing only the crooked silhouette of the building, never realizing that inside, terror was being sculpted into silence. For Elias, the wax of obedience was more than method. It was revelation. He had discovered how to make fear itself bow, how to force the most primal human cry into submission. And with each figure sealed beneath its hardened mask, he felt his control deepen as though the barn itself grew quieter, more reverent, ready to hold the weight of his grow. Elias's rituals had silenced voices, but silence left him restless. He wanted a sound that belonged only to him, a sound that could never be confused with the wind or the shifting of the barn. It had to be a sound carried from those he had taken, a sound that proved their existence did not vanish when their bodies failed. He began to study teeth. To most they were nothing but tools of chewing, discarded in death, broken with age. But Elias believed teeth were more than bone. They were the last defenders of the body, holding fast long after flesh rotted away. He convinced himself that each tooth carried memory, each one a seed of fear absorbed at the moment of greatest terror. If he could gather them, he thought, he could build something eternal, a choir that would never die. His work was delicate. He waited until bodies cooled and wax hardened, until silence was absolute. Then he pried open jaws, stiff with rigor, and began to extract. He did not smash or crack. That would destroy what he thought of as the memory within. He worked with patience, sliding metal picks between gums and bone, twisting until the tooth came free with a faint snap. Each one was handled as if it were a relic, placed carefully into jars lined with cloth, sorted by size and shape. Incisors he called the whispers. Molars he called the drums. Canines he called the cries. Each category mattered to him, for together they would create a layered sound unlike anything heard in the world outside his barn. When enough had been gathered, Elias began to string them. He drilled small holes through the roots, threading wire and gut, arranging them like beads on a necklace. But he did not wear them. Instead, he hung them from rafters in the loft, building strands of teeth that swayed in the draft. At first, the sound was faint, a gentle clicking when wind crept through the boards. Yet to Elias it was music. Each clatter, each rattle was a voice remembered, a fragment of terror preserved. He sat beneath them in silence, listening for hours as the barn filled with the brittle chorus of bone striking bone. He told himself this was their song, a choir of the forgotten singing only for him. As his collection grew, so too did the sound. With dozens of strings swaying, the loft became a chamber of clattering echoes, a place where the air itself seemed alive with whispers. Villagers passing by heard nothing unusual, only the ordinary creak of wood and the sigh of rope. But inside, Elias heard hymns. He heard fear transformed into rhythm, obedience made audible. To him the choir was proof that his dominion did not end with death. The living had cried, the wax had sealed them, but the teeth endured, carrying terror forward, singing it into the hollow of the barn long after breath was gone. At times he would stand among them, letting the strands brush against his face, their clicking surrounding him like applause. He believed the sound confirmed his power, a reminder that even in silence he could summon voices to obey. He began to arrange the teeth with purpose, mixing small with large, creating layers of sound when the wind moved. He called it composition, as though he were a conductor shaping a choir. No one else could hear the order in the noise, but Elias heard it clearly. Each rattle was an offering, each chime a confession. Together they became a hymn of terror that belonged to him alone. To the outside world, Elias was still the quiet son of a respected family, his hands gentle, his demeanor calm. Neighbors saw him walking the fields at dusk, never guessing that he walked with music already in his ears. For when the night air stirred the barn and the rafters trembled with their brittle song, Elias believed he heard proof of eternity. The forgotten were not gone. Their terror still sang for him, bound in strings above his head, clattering in endless obedience. And as the sound echoed through the loft, Elias's faith in his dominion deepened, for he knew he had built not just silence but song, not just death but a choir that could never stop singing his power into the dark. In congregation. The merchant's daughter was not the kind of victim Elias usually chose. She was not nameless, not forgotten, not a stray who could vanish without stirring whispers. She was known, expected, her absence impossible to ignore. And yet Elias desired her for that very reason. To take someone the world valued was a test of his power, a way to measure whether his mask could withstand scrutiny. When she failed to return home from the market road, the village stirred with unease. Lanterns were lit. Search parties formed, voices called her name across the fields. All the while she lay no more than yards away, trapped beneath the floorboards of the Morton Barn. Her cries swallowed by the wood and her scratching mistaken for the skitter of rats. Elias had built the chamber in secret weeks before, cutting planks carefully so they could be lifted and resealed without notice. Beneath the barn's dirt floor, he had lowered a box of wood lined with straw, just wide enough to hold a body curled upon itself. Air holes were drilled with deliberate care, small channels that rose into the barn above like thin flutes. Through them he could hear the breath of whoever lay trapped below. The muffled sobs pressed against the boards. The frantic knocking that to any outsider would sound like nothing more than the shifting of timber. He lowered the girl inside, sealing the lid as though closing a coffin, and then covered the boards with hay so no trace remained. The girl fought with desperate hands, pounding against the wood until her nails splintered and bled. Her voice rose in muffled bursts, words broken into gasps that no one beyond those walls could understand. Elias listened with stillness, crouched above, his ear pressed against the floor. To him, the cries were not pleas for help, but notes in a study of despair. He did not want her dead yet. He wanted to hear the stages of her fading, the slow collapse of her will. He fed her through the holes at first, dripping water, pushing morsels of bread that forced her to endure longer. Every act of mercy was only another turn of the screw, another way to stretch suffering into days. As time passed, the scratching grew weaker, the voice raspier. He recorded the changes in his altered texts, noting how the strength of sound revealed the decline of the body. When the sobs became whimpers, when the pounding slowed to faint taps, he leaned close and whispered words the girl could not make out, promises of release that he never meant to give. Her terror, he believed, was drawn deeper into the boards, etched into the grain, absorbed into the barn itself. He convinced himself that the wood learned from her suffering, that it grew heavy with each muffled cry, holding it like a relic so it could never be forgotten. The villagers searched for weeks, scouring the rivers, questioning travelers, praying in the church. They never thought to look beneath the Morton Barn. To them, Elias remained beyond suspicion, his face calm, his eyes lowered, his voice steady as he joined their prayers. No one knew that each time he stepped inside the barn, he walked above her fading life, hearing her final breath slip upward through the drilled holes like a confession. When at last the scratching stopped altogether, he did not rush to remove her. He left the body sealed in its box, believing the silence itself was the truest sound, proof that terror had been conquered and pressed into the earth. The barn creaked differently after she was gone, as though the planks carried her memory in every groan. Elias sat above the spot night after night, listening to the phantom echoes of her struggle, convinced he had captured more than flesh. To him, she had become part of the structure, another voice buried in the boards, another soul claimed by his ritual. The world outside whispered of kidnappers, of strangers on the road, of wolves that might take a child. But the truth lay beneath their very feet, locked in a box of wood and silence, hidden in a barn they trusted to be empty. Church was the one place where the entire village gathered, where every face could be measured in the soft light of candles, and every voice lifted in hymn was meant to reveal the state of the soul. The Morton family occupied the same pew each Sunday, lined in a row with the certainty of people who had nothing to hide. Their composure had always been admired, their discipline taken as proof of righteousness. Yet over time, a murmur began to spread, a quiet unease that could not be named directly. The Mortons prayed too still. Their lips moved without hesitation, their posture never shifted, their calm unbroken even when sermons cut into the raw heart of sin. While others wept or bowed under conviction, they remained steady as if untouched. And at the center of this stillness was Elias. Those seated near him began to notice first. They spoke later in whispers of how his hands never trembled when he reached for the bread, how his grip was cold even on summer mornings, how he lifted the cup to his lips with the ease of someone who rehearsed each movement. It was not the grace of reverence, but the calculation of control, as though communion were not a sacred meal but a performance measured in seconds. When he touched the shared plate, villagers shivered. His fingers felt damp, not with sweat, but with something freshly washed away, as if they had moments earlier been plunged into suffering. The sensation lingered, a chill that spread from the skin inward, leaving those who noticed uneasy long after the service ended. The pastor praised Elias for his devotion, pointing to his bowed head as an example to younger men. Mothers told their children to emulate his focus, believing his silence was the mark of wisdom. Yet beneath these praises, whispers grew. Some said they avoided sitting beside him, for his presence disturbed their prayers. Others confessed that when his hand brushed theirs at the communion table, they felt as though they had touched something not of flesh, but of stone pulled from cold earth. They did not say these things aloud in daylight. Respect for the Morton family kept suspicion sealed tight. But in the privacy of kitchens, at firesides late at night, the murmurs carried. Elias himself seemed aware of the effect he produced, though not troubled by it. He sat in the pew as if the world revolved around his stillness, never blinking too quickly, never shifting in discomfort. To him, the church was not a place of humility, but another stage, another theater where he could test the mask he had built. Each ritual of communion was to him a ritual of proof. He offered his hands to be seen, knowing no one would dare to accuse them of what they had touched. He drank the cup as though consuming the silence of his victims, folding their absence into the ritual meant for remembrance. To the congregation it was worship. To Elias, it was conquest. Children noticed what their parents dismissed. They said his eyes did not close when he prayed, that he watched the congregation instead, as though measuring their faith. Some swore his lips did not move at all during hymns, though the sound of his voice still carried faintly, timed perfectly with the others. To them it felt as though he was not singing, but echoing, repeating sounds without meaning. Yet when they whispered these fears to adults, they were hushed, told not to slander a family that had given so much to the village. The doubt that grew in the young was smothered by the reverence of the old. And still every Sunday Elias returned. Every Sunday he lifted the bread with hands that seemed too steady, too practiced, too clean of sins that no soap could wash away. Every Sunday he drank as though he alone knew what it meant to consume suffering. The villagers, bound by respect and blinded by tradition, convinced themselves it was only imagination, only nerves, only shadows of thought that had no root in truth. Yet when they looked into his eyes, even for a moment, they found no warmth, no flicker of shared faith, only the cold reflection of someone who did not belong among them, someone who carried another communion entirely in his mind. A communion not of grace, but of blood, silence, and obedience. It was fire that finally broke the silence. One autumn night, when the air was brittle with the smell of harvest and the wind carried sparks too easily, a glow rose from the Morton fields. At first it was thought to be a brush fire, nothing unusual for the season, but the flames came from the barn. Villagers rushed with buckets and shovels, calling for the family, who stood in eerie stillness as the structure crackled. The Mortons did not move to save it. They watched as if nothing of value was inside. Yet the villagers knew that barns held grain, tools, livelihood. They forced their way forward, breaking the doors in hope of salvaging what they could. What they found instead would follow them for the rest of their lives. The heat pressed against them, filling their lungs with smoke and ash. But it was not the fire that drove them back in horror. It was the sight within. The interior of the barn revealed itself as no place of work, no shelter for animals, but a theater of cruelty. Ropes crisscrossed the rafters like veins, sagging under the weight of bodies suspended in grotesque positions. Some hung by their wrists, their joints bent at impossible angles. Others dangled in lattices of pulleys, limbs stretched wide as though displayed for judgment. The wax of obedience still clung to several, their faces sealed beneath hardened masks that glistened as they melted, releasing muffled gurgles that were not quite gone even as the fire licked closer. In the corners lay wooden boxes, lids pried open by heat, revealing shriveled forms curled like children in the womb. Scratches scarred the insides of those coffins, desperate marks of fingernails torn away. The villagers stared, unable to breathe, their eyes wide as the fire's light exposed truths they had denied. The cries they once explained as wind, the scratching they dismissed as rats, the unease they pushed aside, all of it returned with terrible clarity. The barn had never been empty. It had been full, so full that the walls themselves seemed to carry the weight of every hidden voice. Above them, the rafters clattered as the choir of teeth rattled in the heat. Strands of bone swayed like chimes, their brittle notes carried on the draft, a sound that was no hymn but a scream turned into music. Villagers fell to their knees, covering their ears, but the sound pursued them, echoing even as they stumbled out into the night. It was not the sound of the fire that haunted them. It was the rattle of those teeth, each one belonging to someone they had once known, each one now reduced to part of Elias's terrible chorus. The fire grew, devouring wax, ropes, and wood, but it did not destroy quickly enough. The villagers had time to see everything, time to recognize the faces of the lost. They saw the merchant's daughter sealed in wax, her eyes blackened but still fixed in silent horror. They saw the servant boy strung like a broken marionette, ribs protruding through skin. They saw strangers, too, wanderers who had vanished near their roads, all gathered into one congregation of suffering. No one spoke. Words were useless. What they saw could not be carried by language. When the flames forced them back, they looked to Elias, who stood outside with his family, his face as calm as ever. He did not flee, did not protest, did not attempt to deny what had been revealed. He only watched as his theater burned, as though the fire itself was part of his design, a final curtain for the congregation he had built. Some said they saw a faint smile, not wide, not cruel, but small and steady, as if he alone understood that fire could not erase what had been done. For though the barn would collapse, the cries had already been carved into the minds of those who entered, and the memory would not burn away. When the roof fell in and the sparks scattered into the fields, the villagers could no longer call it imagination. The barn had opened, the truth had poured out, and though the flames would reduce the structure to ash, the horrors within would live on in whispers, a darkness too deep to ever be forgotten. When the barn was gone, reduced to black skeleton beams and piles of smoldering ash, the village did not return to silence. The ruin had spilled its secrets into the open, and what was seen could not be unseen. Bodies were dragged from the wreckage, some still coated in wax, others broken into twisted forms that no natural death could explain. Ropes clung to their remains like veins, still pulsing with memory, and the teeth that fell from the rafters scattered across the ground like seeds of terror. People wept, collapsed, turned away retching. Yet Elias Morton did not flinch. He stood as he always had, posture unbroken, eyes calm. Lips pressed into a faint curve of satisfaction, as if the revelation was only another ritual completed. He was taken under guard, though no resistance was needed. Elias walked willingly, as if the path to judgment was a procession he had long rehearsed. His family followed, their faces pale with a stillness that unsettled even more than grief. In the court, the crowd swelled until walls could barely contain them. Farmers, widows, mothers, children, they all came, desperate to make sense of the horrors that had hidden in plain sight. But sense was not found. The evidence carried into the chamber defied language. Wax-coated heads with sealed mouths, boxes with scratch marks carved deep into their interiors, ropes stiff with blood, strands of teeth strung together like garlands. Each object was placed before the court, and each object silenced the room into trembling disbelief. Witnesses tried to describe what they had seen when the barn doors first fell, but words faltered. One man fainted before he could finish, his knees giving way at the memory of wax masks melting in the fire, eyes still wide beneath their coverings. A woman who had lost her daughter collapsed into sobs so violent she could not continue. Even the pastor, a man who had buried the sick and the starved, could barely speak when asked to recount the sight of bodies suspended like marionettes in the rafters. The court recorded their words, but the paper shook with the hands of the scribes. No description could match the weight of the images carved into their minds. Through it all, Elias remained silent. He offered no confession, no defense, no denial. His eyes wandered calmly across the room, pausing on those who stared at him with hatred, resting on those who wept uncontrollably, and always returning to the objects displayed as evidence of his rituals. Some said he smiled when the wax heads were uncovered, as though proud of his craft. Others swore they saw him close his eyes in quiet satisfaction when the teeth chimes were brought forth, their brittle rattle filling the chamber for a moment before being hushed. He did not need to speak. His silence was heavier than words, his composure more disturbing than a cry of guilt. The judges tried to deliver law, but the weight of what was revealed pressed against even their authority. They read charges of murder, desecration, unholy practices, but their voices trembled, breaking on phrases that could not carry the truth. How could they speak plainly of wax suffocation, of bone needles slid into spines, of floorboards hiding living coffins? Their words failed, and in their failure Elias seemed to grow stronger, as though the inability of language to describe his acts proved his power over them all. Sentence was inevitable. Death was declared, though the manner of it was debated in hushed tones, for some feared execution would make him martyr to his own twisted faith. Others demanded fire, to mirror the blaze that had revealed his secrets. Whatever decision was spoken, Elias did not react. He bowed his head slightly as though accepting communion once more, his hands resting in his lap with unnatural calm. It was this calm that broke the people more than the evidence. For in his stillness they saw no regret, no fear, no human response at all. Only the same mask he had worn in church, in the fields, in his home. The mask that had allowed him to hide while bodies piled in the shadows of the barn. When he was led away, the crowd remained in silence. No shouts, no curses, only a heavy stillness that echoed the silence Elias had harvested in his victims. The trial had given them no closure, only confirmation that the evil they suspected had been worse than they could bear to imagine. Elias never confessed. He never would. The truth lay not in his words, but in the faces carried out from the ashes, preserved forever in masks of agony, testifying in silence against the man who had made suffering into ritual and calm into disguise. When the barn was torn down, the villagers expected relief, but the ground did not heal. Nothing grew where the structure once stood. Grass withered, animals avoided the soil, and even children who wandered too close swore they heard faint rattling beneath their feet, as if the earth itself remembered what had been hidden inside. The Mortons left in silence, their names spoken only in anger or fear. Their once admired piety now a curse that lingered in every sermon. The land became a scar that no plow could erase. Yet from the ashes of horror came change. Laws were written demanding stricter care for orphans, new rules forbidding the hidden keeping of wards, stricter oversight of barns and outbuildings near villages. Officials spoke of Elias Morton as a warning, an example of what evil could flourish when trust was blind. But among the people, no law erased memory. Survivors of the families who lost children spoke in whispers, never daring to describe what they had seen in the fire, fearing that to name it aloud might call it back. In every prayer and every silence at communion, they felt the echo of his methods, a shadow pressing at the edges of faith, waiting to return. Elias Morton never raised his voice, never stormed through the village, never showed the wild rage that people expected from evil. He was polite, dutiful, and soft-spoken, a man whose quiet hands were trusted to carry bread to the table or hymn books to the pew. Yet those same hands pressed bone needles into spines, sealed mouths beneath wax, and strung teeth into music. His cruelty was not chaos but order, carried out with patience and method, hidden beneath a mask so ordinary that no one thought to look twice. That was his greatest power, the calmness that concealed. The villagers learned too late that the most terrifying monsters do not roar. They move silently, step carefully, speak with kindness, and let trust cover their tracks. Elias showed that evil does not need madness to thrive, it only needs secrecy and discipline. His rituals were not accidents of rage, but acts of design, each one built like a prayer to a darkness only he served. The barn may have burned, and his body may have faced judgment, but the lesson endured. Cruelty wears a calm face, and silence is its shield. And the question lingered, could it happen again?